Who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? And he said, Certainly I will be with thee, and this shall be the token unto thee that I have sent thee. When thou hast brought forth the people out of Egypt, ye shall serve God upon this mountain. And Moses said unto God, Behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, The God of your fathers hath sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, What is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God said unto Moses, I am that I am. And he said, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, I am hath sent me unto you. And God said moreover unto Moses, Thus shalt thou say unto the children of Israel, The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me unto you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial unto all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together, and say unto them, The Lord God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, and of Jacob, appeared unto me, saying, I have surely visited you, and seen that which is done to you in Egypt. And I have said, I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt unto the land of the Canaanites, and the Hittites, and the Amorites, and the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, and they shall hearken to my voice. And thou shalt come, thou and the elders of Israel, unto the king of Egypt, and ye shall say unto him, The Lord God of the Hebrews hath met with us, and now let us go, we beseech thee, 3 days' journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. And I am sure that the king of Egypt will not let you go. No, not by a mighty hand, and I will stretch out my hand and smite Egypt with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst thereof, and after that he will let you go. And we'll stop there, and let's go ahead and pray. In this passage, verses 11 through 20, 10 verses, we see the word go 5 different times. Some of those by Moses, some of those by God. And we know the passage. God is sending Moses to Pharaoh. He starts off with the burning bush, and God's talking to him. And the children of Israel have been in bondage to Egypt for years up to this point, and God has heard their cry, and because their cry is now sending Moses to deliver them. But this really puts Moses in a difficult situation. You think about it. He's Israeli himself. He's part of the children of Israel. These are his people. Obviously, he doesn't want to see them in bondage, regardless of if he agrees with what they are doing to have gotten in bondage. He still would have loved them as his family and his country. Prime example, there's a lot of things that our country has done and is doing that I don't agree with. I see some of the laws that are being put into place and decisions made by our leaders that I strongly disagree with. I'm not going to get into politics right now, but that doesn't change my love for this country. Whether I agree with what our country is doing or not, it still makes me mad when you see or hear people disrespecting this country. These are his people, and while the situation would have been difficult, he still would have wanted the best for him, but he would be in even more of a difficult spot because he was raised, while he was children of Israel, he was raised Egyptian. He is by birth of the children of Israel, but he was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter. He would have been taught in their way of thinking. I while studying for this, started thinking about this and putting kind of some thought into this part. There would have been the very good possibility that he has a personal relationship with Pharaoh. It's his grandpa. And he's raised by Pharaoh's daughter. This would have been his grandfather. He would have had a personal relationship with Pharaoh. So that any way you look at it, it's going to be extremely awkward after the Pharaoh has allowed you into his home as a child, and now you come back as a man to defy him. That's going to be tough. But then to kind of compound matters even more, he didn't exactly leave on good terms with either nation. I mean, he killed an Egyptian and then hid the body. Obviously, he's lost the trust of the Egyptians with that move. They've now seen where his loyalties lie, but he hasn't exactly left on good terms with his people either. They witnessed it and were none too happy about it. And it's because of his people or it's because his people said something that he left the country in the first place. This is going to be an awkward situation. So when God comes to Moses and tells him, here's what I want you to do, I want you to go back, Moses' response in verse 11, if I can find it again, verse 11, who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? I want to, before we really get to the message, it's still in the introduction, but I want to kind of look at that statement in two different ways. He is arguing with God. He's telling him, God's telling him to go, and he's arguing with God, trying to give reasons why he can't. Why he's the wrong person for the job, which we really do often. That God, I can't, and let me kind of lay out the reasons why. But just like with Moses, God isn't interested in our excuses, just our obedience. The other way I want us to look at this is, and this is kind of the way I want to get us to look as we go through this message, Moses, while it was to make excuses, Moses recognized his weaknesses. He recognized his limitations, and he tried to use that for an excuse, but give him some credit. He recognized that he had some weaknesses, that he couldn't do this. While we shouldn't argue with God, we should see that we have limitations. Moses says in his own weakness, he saw why in his mind he couldn't, which again is a good thing for us to see. When I had my Jeep, one of my favorite guys to go with, his name was Mike, and Mike had a ton of money dumped into his Jeep. He bought the thing nearly brand new, told me he bought it for like $30,000, spent thousands into building it because he wanted to know it was done right, so he bought the best parts and had it put in it at four-wheel drive shops instead of doing any of the work himself and all that. My Jeep, on the other hand, we laughed about a lot because my Jeep, I bartered for the Jeep. I traded the guy a truck that I had for the Jeep. My lift kit was a mix of parts that Bo and I had scrounged off of other vehicles, most of it out of a junkyard, and put together and put it on it to lift it. Most of the parts that I had for it, I got either free or traded junk that was wasting space in my garage. So Mike and I would go out together quite often, him with his fancy Jeep with a V8 and my, as we joked about it, my junkyard build with a 4-cylinder. But here's why I liked going out with Mike. Mike was big on, it was something he said all the time, knowing you and your vehicle's limitations. You know, when you're out in different areas, that his thing was there's no shame in not going over some obstacle because you knew your limitations. I wasn't that smart and typically just pushed the gas pedal harder, but that was Mike's motto, which really is very true in life and in ministry. Think about this. Who am I to serve God? That's what Moses is saying. Moses wasn't making much of himself. He wasn't saying, boy, God is blessed to have me. Moses knew, I can't do this. Moses knew, I can't do this on my own. In honesty, if anyone had the ability to go to Moses because of his to go to Pharaoh because of his upbringing, it would have been Moses. Amen. He was raised in a way and would have been familiar with and comfortable with being in front of the Pharaoh. If anyone could, it would have been him. But he knew without God, he couldn't lead the children of Israel out. He couldn't do it without God. And you and I ought to recognize the same thing, that we are nothing to go for God. I am nothing to go for God, but he uses me anyways. Now we get to the message, because Moses says, I can't go. I know my weakness. I can't do this. And God's response to Moses applies to each and every one of us. When God wanted Moses to go, number one, God already knew his weaknesses. When God came to Moses, when God came down and came to Moses and said, I want you to go lead the people out, he already knew Moses' weaknesses. First weakness that Moses pointed out is, I'm going to word it this way, that I'm just a man. Look at chapter 4, verse 1. It says, And Moses answered and said, But behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, The Lord hath not appeared unto thee. That's what he's saying. They're going to say that I'm just doing this on my own. I'm just a man. I can't lead the people. But God already knew that. Then he says, I can't talk good. If you skip down chapter 4, verse 10, And Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I'm not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue. Use the excuse, I don't talk very well. Some people, some pastors I've heard kind of go off on the slow to speech and say that, maybe he stuttered or those sorts of things, which may have been, that he had a hard time spitting his words out. But I'm kind of focused on he uses the word, I'm not eloquent of speech. And there's a difference between someone who gets up in front of a crowd and talks, and someone who gets up in front of a crowd and can eloquently speak. There is a difference. When I worked at the funeral home, at some point in every service, whoever was the funeral director had to get up and say something. Maybe it was announcing a graveside service or reception or viewing instructions or even how to exit. They had to say something at some point in the service. And they all did it. It was part of their job. But they didn't all do it the same. There were some who would get up there and it was very obvious they weren't comfortable being in front of people, and they said the least that they could possibly get away with. They gave basic instructions and then they walked away. There was one guy who, I don't know if he had some sort of training in public speaking, but at least he came across this way, that he would get in front of the crowd and he would give, every time, some very eloquent speech explaining what was going to happen next. They would both get the same message across. They were both giving, in essence, the same instructions, but there's a big difference in how it comes across and how it's delivered. That's what Moses is saying. I can't go in front of Pharaoh. I don't talk well enough to stand in front of him. And I love God's response. You see it in verse 11. Right after he says, I'm not eloquent of speech, I'm slow of speech and slow of tongue. God says, the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb, or deaf, or seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? God just says, do you remember who made your mouth? You're going to complain about your mouth not working right to the one who made your mouth? Here's what's happening. Moses is pointing out his weaknesses to God, and God's saying, don't you think I already knew this? I knew before I ever called you. It's not like Moses is giving these excuses to God and God says, I didn't take that into consideration. I hadn't thought about the fact that you're slow of speech. Maybe I should, talk to someone else about this. No, he tells Moses, I knew. I made you. Reminds me of the story of Gideon. The angel of the Lord finds Gideon and he wants him to lead the army of Israel, and he finds him in hiding. And Gideon tries to explain that I can't because of his lineage. I am the youngest son of the smallest family and the smallest tribe and the smallest part. But God already knew that. He put Gideon there. Here's what I love about this. God knows my weaknesses too. God knows our weaknesses too. He knows that you aren't perfect, and he still wants to use you. People always try to make excuses why they can't serve God, but here's what I always find funny about that. Their excuses are always things that God made in them. Now, some of the common excuses, I can't because people scare me. I've known very few pastors who, before being called to preach, liked being in the public eye. In fact, most are the opposite. Most pastors I know get very nervous around people. Our pastor has said it tons of times that when he was in high school, just the idea of standing in front of a crowd, he had to hyperventilate. I've personally said that the idea of being in front of people scares me. I can't remember off the top of my head right now. There was one well-known pastor who was known that he would stay in his office until when he got up to preach because being up here just scared him so much. All sorts of pastors in the past that have been that same way, but God knew that and said, go anyways. Or people will try to use the excuse that I can't because like Moses, I'm not eloquent. I don't have to tell you in here, you listen to me every week. I'm not real eloquent of speech. I don't give, some fancy oratory, but God knew when he called me anyways. For some, the excuse is, I can't because I'm not educated or whatever else the excuse may be. But God knew and says, go anyway. Here's what I find interesting. God knew your weaknesses before you knew them. Think of Jeremiah 1:5. Before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. Before thou camest forth out of the womb, I sanctify thee. But that first part of that, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee. Before you were even in the womb, God knew you, which means he knew your weaknesses before you were even a speckle in your parent's eye. And he says, go anyways. When God told Moses go, when God came to Moses and said, I want you to go, he already knew Moses' weaknesses. Number two, when God told Moses go, he sent him and he went with him. Remember what one of Moses' concerns was, that I'm just a man. But God didn't want Moses to go and lead the people out under his own power. Moses wasn't to go to Pharaoh and say, I am leading the people out. I am here to take the children of Israel. He was to go as a mouthpiece. That song that Miss Connie sang, I'll say what you want me to say. Moses didn't have to come up with the words to say. Remember, Moses was concerned that because he wasn't eloquent, God says, just go. I'll give you the words. You don't have to know what to say. I was thinking of this, you have no idea how many times people have come to me and told me that the reason they don't witness is if someone were to ask them a question that they wouldn't know what to say, and because of that they're too scared to go door knocking or those sorts of things. But we don't have to know all the answers. We just have to be God's mouthpiece. Moses didn't have to come up with what to say. Moses didn't have to come up with what to do. Can you imagine Moses trying to come up with the idea of the plagues on his own? I mean, just the way the plagues are, a person wouldn't have thought of these. Had every time Pharaoh said no, Moses, having to try to think up on his own how he's going to react or what he's going to do, it would have never worked. But Moses didn't have to. God already had all that worked out because Moses wasn't going on his own accord. This wasn't just something that he decided on his own that should be done, and so he was going to go do it. He was sent of God, and because of that, he wasn't going alone. I am was with him. He didn't have to think of what to say. He didn't have to think of what to do because God was there with him and he told him what to say and what to do. And the very same thing is true for us. When God sends us, he doesn't send us to go do it alone. He doesn't say, just go out there and figure it out for yourself. He goes with us. You're not left to figure it out on your own. When God said to Moses, when God said go to Moses, he already knew Moses' weakness. When God said, go to Moses, he sent him and was with him. And then thirdly tonight, when God said, go to Moses, God had a plan. I already quickly mentioned this, and I purposely tried to not go into much detail earlier with it because I didn't want to get ahead of myself. But Moses didn't have to make up a plan. When God sent him, God already had it figured out. God already knew what he was doing. I'm not going to read the passage again, verse 14 through 22. He already has it, 14 through 20, that we already looked at earlier. God already has a plan of what's going to happen. He had a plan for how he was going to address the people. It wasn't going to be automatic that they would follow him. It's not like Moses was going to walk in and say, I'm here to lead you out, and the people will be thrilled. Yay, our hero Moses is here. It wasn't going to happen. Moses had made mistakes, and what's worse is the people knew that. That's why he left. That was going to cause difficulty. I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you were trying to lead someone and all they wanted to do was point out your past mistakes. That makes life real hard. Makes life difficult. More than that, more than just he had made mistakes and they knew it, they were content where they were at. While things were difficult and they were crying unto God to ease their burden, their idea wasn't run out of Egypt. Their idea was make it easier in Egypt. You can see that pretty easily as they go through trials in the wilderness. It's, well, I wish we were back in Egypt. Life was so much better there. They were content where they were. So it was going to be difficult, but God had a plan. God had a plan for addressing Pharaoh. Pharaoh wasn't going to like this. Imagine what Moses is doing here. Again, someone who grew up in Pharaoh's home and now coming to Pharaoh and saying, I know you have these servants and you've got used to them doing your work and you're pushing them, wanting them to do more, but I want you to let me take them all. There's no way Pharaoh's going to hear that and be happy about it. There's no way he's going to hear that and, oh yeah, this sounds like a great idea. Go for it. No, this is going to be something that's going to make him mad. But God had a plan. God knew that Pharaoh wouldn't be true to his word. Multiple times he tells Moses, okay, and then changes his mind. God knew and had a plan. God knew it was going to take convincing. Again, none of this took God by surprise. It isn't as if Pharaoh said no and God thought, well, what am I going to do now? Oh, I know, I'll send a plague. No, God knew exactly what Pharaoh would do, and God had a plan for it all. Just put it this way, God knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing. Here's the application for this message tonight. When God says go, I really do think it's smart for us to realize that we can't do it. To realize that on my own power, I cannot do this. I think it's good for us to see that I don't have the ability in myself to be able to do this. Otherwise, we're going to do it in our strength rather than God's. But our lack of ability shouldn't stop us from going. Us seeing our weaknesses shouldn't stop us from doing what it is that God has called us to do. Recognizing our weakness doesn't mean sitting on the sidelines. It doesn't mean that since I have this weakness, well then God can't use me. Because when God says go, He already knew that. When He called you, He already knew that. When God says go, He's going with you. And when God says go, He already has a plan. Here's what it comes down to. We just need to realize that He's with us and go.